And the timber henge here, the big one, wood henge, is over there in the direction of the sunrise. You wonder if there is a connection between sunrise and sunset, between birth and death. And the stones are associated with death and the ancestors, and the wooden henge is associated with life. And so you have ceremonies at Woodhenge where a lot of people, a lot of noise, people who recently died are involved in ceremonies that are beginning to take them into the world of the ancestors. And they travel from Woodhenge across the landscape, down the river and up the avenue into the centre of the circle here, where they join the stones who are the ancestors, and they enter the world of the ancestors. So this is like a doorway from life into death.
And then the procession, presumably, was a key part of that.
This concept of procession, of movement, is written into the landscape with this long avenue earthwork. If this idea works, if there's some truth in it, then what happens is by the time the people actually reach the stone circle, they are no longer of this world. So we're not looking for physical remains.
Indeed, no human remains have been found at the centre of Stonehenge. The passage from sunrise to sunset is the journey from birth to death. The transition from wood to stone represents the way in which our soft bodies eventually turn to hard white bone. Although the avenue that linked the living and the dead at Stonehenge has been almost erased, there is one still standing at Avebury, which can give us a good idea of how the procession might have looked.
Quite something after being at Stonehenge, isn't it? Where we know the avenue's there, but you walk along it and you can't see it.
The thing that strikes me is the avenue marked by these sucking great stones. The Stonehenge avenue isn't, is it?
Apparently not, although William Stukeley claimed at Stonehenge that he could see in the ground where stones like these had been removed from the avenue. And that's never been tested by excavation, so it's just possible there was something like this at Stonehenge. Somehow you feel that these stones are actually enclosing a space that is special, that is sacred in some way. Perhaps there were processions here, or perhaps these processional routes were actually enclosing spaces that were keeping people out.
Yes, I can almost imagine this thing being lined by people.
But Stonehenge and Avebury did not stand alone. Like churches today, stone circles were dotted all over the landscape. Archaeologists are currently looking for the remains of one right next to the Avebury Avenue.
Mr. Faulkner, mid-19th century antiquary, claimed when he was riding a horse in this area that he spotted the remains of a stone circle. There was one stone which remains standing. Now Faulkner thought that he saw two further stones which were lying flat, then a series of hollows that marked the positions of other stones which had been removed or had been broken up and taken away. Yeah. These are the remains of a stone which have actually been deliberately smashed up. It's in the right place, but of course two stones don't make a circle, so we've got to look for more if we're really going to demonstrate that Mr. Faulkner was right. These may be small family shrines, if you like, places where 20 or 30 people might congregate, but you have centres like Avebury, which are the focus for really massive communal gatherings involving people coming in from well outside the region.
Josh did find his circle, which is hardly surprising since in 2000 BC, Britain was covered with these monuments to the ancestors. This was the heyday of a religion which venerated the ancestors and celebrated the inevitable journey from life to death that we are all in the process of making. But why were the dead ancestors so important to these people? Why did they believe that they could walk the souls of the dead into the afterlife? What lay behind this macabre rehearsal for death?
So why were the ancestors so important to these people that they were prepared to worship them as gods? to understand the origins of these beliefs, we have to go back to a time long, long before the construction of the great henges.
Trying to understand a religion without knowing its origins is rather like attempting to explain the meaning of the Christian cross without knowing the story of the crucifixion. In search of origins, we must travel back 6,000 years to the time when the first religious monuments began to appear. This was also the time when people began a new agricultural way of life, and it's not a coincidence. This is Knapp Hill. Near its summit is a causewayed enclosure. They appear at the birth of Britain's prehistoric religion. These are circular ditches dug into the earth. A radical new idea about what they mean has come from archaeologist Richard Bradley.
Whew. Fairly steep old bank, isn't it?
Well, by Fenton standards.
So that's the ditch, is it?
That's the ditch.
Richard believes that these ditches represent a completely new relationship between humans and the land.
Where it's very dark green.
Yeah, because the grass is taking advantage of the moisture. It's growing better at this time of year than the area around it. Runs for, what, about 10 metres, probably about 2 metres deep.
Yeah.
And the spoil they dig out from it is the bank we're standing on.
Right.
Probably 3,500 BC.
You could make an argument, make a case for these being the first ceremonial sites.
Yes, I think they are.
What do you think lay behind them? I mean, here we are in a fantastic location, halfway to the sky. I mean, what do you think was going on?
People who are adopting a totally different way of life often seek security in an origin myth, a belief about how things came to be. And I think we can understand the monuments in this country in terms of a real or imagined origin in distant places and in a different sort of world.
So what caused this huge change?
I think there's a very big change when people start using crops and animals. They have a different relation to the land than from hunter-gatherers. Right. Hunter-gatherers tend to take from nature to act in partnership with nature, in a sense to operate in harmony with nature. They don't impose, and generally they don't own resources. Farmers own resources and have to plan for the future. This implies a particular conception of time. It involves the work of generation upon generation to be viable, and that's very, very different.
It's really ultimately about owning the land that you're farming. And in a way, you claim that your great-grandfather was there, and that is your claim to the land.
This was the first time that the people of Britain had owned, organised and controlled the land. There was a new desire to create boundaries between different holdings to determine who owned what. And when you share out the land, there is always neutral territory, no man's land. It was in these special spaces that the causewayed enclosures were built.
Is that significant, the fact it's on the edge?
Some of the things that happen at places like this are dangerous. They're where you deal with the dead, with strangers. They're places to set apart from the normal pattern of daily life.
In this new farming landscape, the cult of the ancestors is born. Their influence was necessary for the continued fertility of the land. For the ancient Britons, the discovery of crops, something which when you cut it down can be regrown from the seeds of the dead, must have been a kind of magic. And it's possible that they believed that these ceremonial enclosures were fields for the dead, a place where the ancestors' souls could, like the crops, grow to life again. These fields for the dead were everywhere in the landscape, and they remained special places for thousands of years. Maiden Castle in Dorset is a magnificent hill fort which started life as a causewayed enclosure 6,000 years ago.
Okay, well, we're standing on this big lump here, which is an artificial bank. But this bank itself is built on top of a very much earlier one that was built about just after 4000 BC. And that monument is the earliest thing that we know on this hilltop. Probably things were going on here even before the first camp was built, before 4000 BC.
Like Knapp Hill, this was a special place in the landscape, because it belonged to everyone and no one.
In the Bronze Age, the westernmost rampart running up there probably incorporates a boundary ditch. These boundary ditches ran up to important central meeting places. There must have been pressure on land. They needed to divide one community from another. But then there was also need for these groups from time to time to come together, to agree things, to have ceremonies and so on.
What it looks like then is that these central places developed in neutral spots on the boundaries. I mean, presumably they were the safe places where people could meet.
Yes, a common area. Keeping people apart, but people still have to come together for détente. And a special activity went on within that defined area.
This was a place where things happened, where communities met. Land had acquired a new meaning for the ancient Britons, and these patches of common land, packed with ancestral bones, became magical. What began as a celebration of a new relationship with the land became a way of life. The people who constructed the hill fort thousands of years later knew that they were building on a sacred place. But Maiden Castle has a sad epilogue. Its story was taken up by archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
It's the most dramatic thing that I've ever been concerned with.
He found what he believed were the remains of a vicious battle between the Romans and the ancient Britons.
I've got a clear vision almost of what happened and how it happened. They came into a rush. It's the only way they could do it. They got in amongst these chaps. They cut down the defenders, in mass formation almost. One of these Britons was cut down with no less than 7 cuts on his skull. It was a massacre. The place was littered with corpses in no time. We found 40 of them, all with fatal wounds. It was very vivid. Dramatic.
Wheeler was a military man, as you know. This fantastic graphic description of the natives being beaten up by the Roman army. But only a certain number of the burials, only 14 of the burials, actually had evidence of injuries and wounds.
I seem to remember from the very recent excavations that some of the bodies there, the cuts, had actually healed over in the bone.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And clearly, that takes quite some time. So it's not as Wheeler had perhaps portrayed it.
It's no surprise Sir Mortimer Wheeler found so many bodies. We now know that Maiden Castle had been an important burial ground for thousands of years. Wheeler didn't acknowledge this because he was so captivated by the military success of the Romans. This is typical of the short-sighted view we British have of our own prehistory. Look at our buildings, our heroes, the way we work ourselves into the ground, the dark history of our imperialism, and we look like the sons and daughters of Rome. But we are not. Being invaded by the Romans had a terrible effect, not just on how we view our own history, but on how we developed as a nation. We've come to believe the Roman colonization of this country was a civilizing act, when in fact it was a brutal suppression. It's hardly surprising that we did the same thing to countries in Africa and Asia 2,000 years later. It's time to let go of our Roman inheritance and embrace our real heritage.